Okay, hello everyone. My name is Paweł, and together with my colleague Arek, who is sitting right there, we've prepared a presentation entitled Evaluation of Transactional Controls in e-banking Systems. To be more specific, we will discuss a security control which is called Transaction Integrity Verification, and this control should be used in e-banking systems. During this presentation, we will try to define some requirements or to specify some features for that control to be effective. To do that, we will evaluate effectiveness of methods which are currently in use. Okay, so who are we? In the first place, we are very modest people, so we don't like to talk about ourselves. If someone is interested, he can check our bios on Confidence site or on LinkedIn. We both have a technical background, also related to internet banking, in both building and breaking. Now we work in the risk management area, so this presentation is more about controls and controls effectiveness than about details, technical details of particular attack. So this presentation will not be as technical as the previous one. Okay, so basically it goes without saying that internet banking is very popular. So let's see some numbers. There are about 38 million people in Poland, and according to some statistics, there are about 24 banking accounts with internet banking, of which 8 million are actively used. Banks try to encourage people to use internet banking because this is profitable to them. For example, it is cheaper than maintaining traditional banking facilities. Internet banking is advertised as easy, convenient, and secure, but banks usually do not tell why this is secure. Moreover, quite often they simplify some security features to make the systems more user-friendly. We must be aware that currently ordinary users use internet banking. They don't have technical knowledge. They are not aware of all the risks associated with this technology. And as a result, they can be easy targets. And of course, if there are targets, there are attackers. Motivation is obvious here, steal some money, and the only question is how to do it. So basically, we can discern two types of attacks: targeted attacks and mass or opportunistic attacks. Targeted attacks may be very profitable to the attacker if targets are selected carefully. On the other hand, those attacks can be more complicated to perform, and they may be more risky to the attacker. Mass attacks are different. Single attack needn't be very profitable. Also, the attackers don't care from whom they steal money. The most important factor here is the scale of the attack. The more victims, the better. Usually there are quite a few successful attacks in a single campaign, so the attacker walks out with a sufficient amount of money to pay off his effort. During this presentation, we will try to find some control which may be effective in preventing such mass attacks. Okay, so we all know how internet banking system operates. Nevertheless, let's try to describe this using use cases. The basic use cases are view account information, manage account parameters, transfer money, manage defined transfers, and send an application. Some of these use cases can be extended. For example, there is internal money transfer between accounts which belong to the same user, and there are various types of external money transfers to some arbitrarily chosen accounts. Defined transfers can be executed, but they can also be modified. Users can send various applications which can be used, for example, to change account configuration, add additional access channel, add proxy to an account, or even to create new users. And of course, attackers see this system differently. The attackers will try to convert every use case to some misuse case. So what are the misuse cases? Of course, disclosed account information is probably the most obvious one. If the attacker gains access to user's account, he's able to see all the data in the system, which is available in this system to that user. This information is valuable. It may be sold, but it can be also used in some more sophisticated attacks, for example, in some social engineering attacks. However, stealing information is good, but always stealing money is better. So we have this transfer money to attacker misuse case, and this can be achieved either directly using some money transfer functionality or indirectly. For example, the attacker can modify some defined transfer and wait for user to execute it. The attacker can also try to add new access channel using some application. Of course, this access channel should be controlled by the attacker. He may even create new user, like Sławek did in this beautiful system he described previously. The attacker can even modify the mailing address for some user and then order new credit or debit card, which will be mailed to this new address along with the PIN code. So, as you can see, there is more than one way to skin a cat. Once more, what are the attacker's motivations? So this may be as simple as disclosing some information which is accessible through the banking system interface. This can be also as complicated as influencing financial markets. For example, by buying some stocks or performing money exchanges. For the sake of this presentation, we will assume that the main goal of attacker is simple. This is only about transferring money to him. So as a result, the scope of our analysis can be narrowed down only to these use cases and misuse cases, which can allow attacker achieving this goal. So basically, we don't care about disclosing information, but we do care about everything else. So any other use case probably should be protected by this additional control we are talking about. Okay, so now let's see actors and interactions which take place when some user uses internet banking system. So there are three actors: the user itself, the web browser which is used by the user, and the banking system. When user executes some operation, he initially provides details of the operation to the browser, and then the browser sends it to a banking system. The system returns some summary information to the browser. A browser presents it to the user. In the next step, the user confirms that he wants to perform the given operation. Usually some additional code is appended here, and this code is used to confirm or to authorize that operation, that transaction. This is passed back to the banking system. A banking system verifies this authorization data. If it is okay, it executes transaction and sends information about execution of that transaction back to the user. Okay, so now it's time to introduce some evil. What threats should we consider? Because we are talking about mass opportunistic attacks, threats are quite obvious here. This is malware, this is active man in the middle, and phishing and spoofing. So all those threats are expressed on this slide, used lingo from Information Security Forum threat list. we can map those threats to our interaction diagram. Phishing is not mapped anywhere because it can happen everywhere. Malware usually affects web browser and workstation of the user, and active man in the middle happens between the web browser and the banking systems. But what malicious activities can be performed by the attacker? It is possible to modify parameters of the transaction which is being executed by the user. This can be achieved by using malware or active man in the middle. As a result, the banking system receives a different transaction or even different operation than the one initiated by the user. And this applies to interactions 1 and 2. Probably you can't see it, sorry. It is also possible to modify data which is returned from the system to the user. As a result, the user thinks that the original operation will be executed and is not aware of malicious modification which happened. And this applies to interaction 3 and 4 and 9 and 10 at the bottom. Okay, but interactions 5 and 6, so these connected with transaction authorization, are also very interesting. The attacker is able to not only eavesdrop on the authorization data, but he's also able to block execution of that transaction, optionally hiding this from the user. Data which is gathered in this step may be then used by the attacker to initiate new transaction and authorize it. And the same happens with phishing. Phishing happens here. So the attacker is able to gather some data which then can be used to execute some operation initiated by the attacker. What controls are typically used in internet banking systems? So, of course, we have authentication. The user needs to identify himself and prove his identity to the system. There is also access control. After authentication, the user is allowed to perform only those operations for which he is authorized. But we need to assume that these controls may have been defeated. And as a result, the attacker is now able to access this system in context of some legitimate user. So what's now? Is it game over? Well, no, or at least it shouldn't be the game over, because there is one more control to defeat. To execute an operation, especially external money operation, the attacker needs to authenticate or authorize that transaction. And this control can be also used and should be used to verify the integrity of that transaction. And this control is sometimes called transaction integrity verification, although in Poland it's called autoryzacja transakcji. Okay, so what is transaction integrity verification? Basically, this is a generic term which is used to describe a method of verifying that the actual content of some transaction has not been modified by the attacker. This is not only about confirming that the user really wants to perform an operation, but the operation with particular parameters. And as you can see, we used Wikipedia as reference for that, but this is not because we believe that Wikipedia is the best source of knowledge, but in this case, it seems that this is the only source. So we searched various standards and guides to check if there is anything mentioned about transaction integrity verification. And the best of what we found is the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard version 2, which, as far as I know, is still in beta. In point 1.22, SMS, two-factor authentication, or transaction signing is mentioned. But as you can see, this is a very general requirement. So based on that, it is really difficult to say what features such a control should have. So as it was mentioned during the first talk, we have security camera. But is it effective? We don't know. And we will try to define some requirements by analyzing the effectiveness of methods which are commonly in use. Let's start with defining some scenarios which should be prevented by such control. In the first place, we would like to prevent the attacker from using obtained data to execute transactions without any user interaction. And there are three variants of that scenario. The first variant is the worst one. The attacker can use the obtained data to perform multiple transactions of his choice. The second scenario is a limited version of the first one. And in this scenario, the attacker is able to perform only one or very limited number of transactions. And this may be important if there are additional controls that do not allow the attacker to steal all the money at once. For example, some kind of limits. In the third scenario, the attacker is limited only to performing operations which meet some specific criteria. And this may not be clear for now, but we will come back to this later. We would also like to make it impossible to modify the operation which is being executed by a legitimate user. So, on-the-flight modifications. There are also two versions of such scenario. The attacker may be able to make unlimited changes to the transaction, or he may be limited in some way. And last but not least, we would like to prevent the attacker from just replaying transactions which were performed by some legitimate user. Let's see what methods are currently in use. But please be aware that for the sake of this presentation, we had to limit the number of methods included. And additionally, each of these methods can be implemented slightly differently, which also influences its effectiveness. We are happy to discuss this after this presentation. But the following methods will be included. Classic transaction authentication number, one-time password generators, so basically hardware tokens, tokens based on time, and tokens based on some challenge response algorithm. Then we consider digital signature and so-called MTANs, so transaction authentication numbers which are delivered by SMS. We will use this table to show effectiveness of particular control. As you can see, this table considers difficulty of the attack and its impact. So if you can use phishing to obtain data which allows you to perform any operation of your choice, this is really, really bad. If you need malware to do that, the impact is still large, but the attack itself is slightly more sophisticated. On the other hand, if you have malware on a victim workstation, and the only thing which you can do is replaying some transaction, well, the impact of the attack is very limited. Ideal method should prevent all those scenarios, but as you may expect, there is no ideal method. We can check which methods prevent, or rather could prevent, most of this. And there is one more important thing to understand. When we say that the control is effective, we don't say that the attack is impossible. We do say, however, that when particular method is in use, the user is receiving enough information to spot the attack, make an informed decision, and perform some corrective actions. So let's start with classic transactional authentication numbers. Typically, this method uses a list of one-time passwords, which is delivered to the user using some independent channel. All passwords are generated upfront and obviously are not related to any specific transaction, and each password can be used only once. And as you can see, this is a very weak security method. The attacker is able to do almost everything. So it is easier to explain why some scenarios are not possible to execute. In the first place, phishing cannot be used to perform on-the-fly modification of operation in progress, and it rather cannot be used to perform replay attack. Okay, I can try to convince user to press this refresh button in his browser, but this is not the kind of attack we are talking about. And replaying of transaction is not possible because each password can be used only once. All the other scenarios are possible to execute, mainly because there is no link between the code and particular transaction. And as you remember, information which is displayed in the banking system interface cannot be trusted because it may be forged by the attacker. And of course, we have at least one attack scenario behind each of these cells, but we don't have time to discuss this during this presentation. So let's move to the next method. Token, which generates one-time passwords based on current time. So this is hardware solution and it must be secure, right? Not really. Again, there is no link between the code and the transaction. You may expect that the effectiveness of this method is very similar to classic TANs. And yes, this is true. There are only two important differences. First, because a one-time password is generated based on the current time, the attacker is not able to obtain future codes unless he has access to seed of the token or to the token itself. Physical access to the token, of course, is possible, but it doesn't fit well in our mass attack model. On the other hand, obtaining seeds for all the tokens may be possible. We had this RSA breach, didn't we? Okay, so additionally, we assume that replay attack is not possible because some additional control exists which do not allow to execute multiple operations using the same code. So basically there is some limitation to one transaction per minute. You must remember that this last assumption may not be valid for all implementations. And if this is the case, then the attacker is not limited only to the replay attack, but he can perform any operation of his choice, and the only limit is the time. He needs to perform this operation while the code is still valid. Okay, so there is almost no difference between classic TANs and and time-based tokens. How about tokens which are based on a challenge response algorithm? In this scenario, the one-time password is computed based on a challenge for particular transaction, and the challenge should be derived from transactions parameters. Moreover, this challenge should allow the user to verify this transaction. Unfortunately, the length of the challenge is limited. Typically, this is 6 or 8 digits. So multiple transactions can result in the same challenge. In this particular case, we also assume that counter or time is not used during computation of the response. So is this method more effective? Yes, it is. It is because unconstrained modification here of a transaction is no longer possible. If important parameters changes, then the challenge also changes. And as a result, the user, at least in theory, can spot the attack. However, it is still possible to perform constraint modification of operation in progress, and the only requirement is that the challenge derived for that operation is the same as for the original one. And because the challenge is very short, this is quite simple to achieve. Additionally, if the attacker has single pair of challenge and response, he can perform multiple operations, and the only limit is that the challenges for those new operations are the same as for the captured one. So he is not limited only to replay attack, which of course is also possible. Effectiveness of this method can be improved by including some random nonce in the challenge, but because the challenge is very short, it is better to use tokens which includes time or a counter during derivation of the response. Now let's move to digital signatures. Strong cryptography is used. The key is stored on a smart card, so we can assume that this is secure, and all the important parameters are signed. Transaction details are presented to the user during the signing process, so that he can verify them. And let's assume that nonce is generated by the server, so the replay attack is no longer possible. Is it the perfect method? Unfortunately, no, because the signing process is usually performed using a software component which is installed and run on user's workstation. And this workstation may be infected with some malware, so definitely this is not a trusted environment. As a result, the attacker can modify data which is presented to the user during the signing process, or sign any data of his choice if the smart card has been left in the reader. And it happens a lot, and recently Hasperbot malware is using this fact. So the only scenario which cannot be achieved using malware is the reply attack, but let's face it, this is not a big consolation. So again, this method can be very effective if the signing process is performed in some trusted environment or some trusted device. Of course, this device would need to present all important parameters to the user, and this information needs to be provided to this device somehow, and this is also quite a big challenge. Okay, let's move to the next method, last but not least, MTANs. In this solution, the authentication code is created when user initiates the transaction. The code is delivered to the user along with information about the transaction itself. So the user can verify the transaction. But some information is presented in a shortened form. So this applies also to the beneficiary account, and as you may expect, it leads to some problems. The attacker can modify original transaction in such a way that this modification will not be reflected in the SMS message. And as a result, the attacker is able to perform limited modification of operation in progress. But we have also bigger problem, malware on user phone. And if this is the case, the attacker is able to perform any operation of his choice anytime. Really, game over. So please also note that the malware is not the only possible scenario of overtaking this out-of-bound channel. It can be also achieved using some attacks on GSM network or by attacking the GSM service provider, which is used to send SMS. And for me, this provider is the best target. Also, SIM card cloning may be possible, and in some countries, this is much easier in others. Okay, so we had a quick glance at some methods, and as you may have noticed, two of these methods are much more effective than the other ones. These methods are digital signature and MTANs. So what makes these methods effective? For MTANs, an out-of-bound channel is used to pass back the information about operation to the user. Additionally, the code which is delivered in SMS can be used to confirm only that transaction for which it was generated. If we put aside our limited trust in the security of GSM network, this method has only one apparent weakness. Information about the transaction is presented in a shortened form, which may allow the attacker to perform limited on-the-fly modification of an operation. Of course, we know that there are successful attacks on banks which use MTANs, but this is attack on the user, not on the method itself. Digital signature is effective because all the important parameters of the transactions are signed by the client and are verified by the system. User can verify what is being signed, so he can spot malicious modification. Of course, on the other hand, the signing process is performed using software which is executed in an untrusted environment and can be tampered by the attacker. So, as you can see, there is no perfect solution. However, we can try to specify some features which should be offered by an effective transaction integrity verification control. Two sets of requirements can be defined. One for out-of-bound channel-based methods, and second for transaction signing. So let's start with the requirements for out-of-bound channel-based methods. In the first place, of course, this out-of-bound channel must exist. The attacker should not be able to monitor and to modify messages which are sent over this channel, and this channel should be difficult to overtake. So, for example, some banks use phone call to pass authentication or authorization code to the user. Automat calls the user, and this automat provides this code. But if a user doesn't pick up the phone, the code can be recorded on a voicemail. And you can access this voicemail with simple spoofer, caller ID spoof. So this channel is very easy to overtake. Second requirement. Operations should be presented clearly, so it must be obvious to the user what operation will be executed. All the important parameters for the specific type of transaction, or rather operation, should be presented to the user so that he could verify them. And again, this is a very tricky requirement. Let's say we want to use this out-of-band channel to confirm some application. How you will present all important parameters of an application in 160 characters, which you can use in SMS message. So this is not so easy. Yeah, and it costs more. Talk to banks about that. Okay. Additionally, it should be difficult to the attacker to find two different operations which will be presented to the user in exactly the same form. So if data is shortened, it may be possible, so you should shorten this data in such a way that the attacker is not able to achieve this collision easily. Okay, and last requirement, for each operation, a unique code should be used. This code should be generated only after operation was initiated by the user and must be valid only for that operation. If one of these requirements is not met, some of the attacks discussed previously probably are possible. And what are the requirements for transaction signing? In the first place, the user must know what operation he's signing. This is the single and the most important requirement for all methods which are based on transaction signing. Information about the operation must be trusted, so the attacker should not be able to forge it. Unfortunately, this is almost impossible to achieve if the signing code runs in an untrusted environment. Independent signing devices are safer in this context, but also are less convenient to use. Next requirement. User action should be required, so attacker should not be able to simulate user actions to sign any data of his choice. Ideally, some physical action of the user should be required during the signing process. For independent signing devices, this is usually in place, but for all other methods, this can be quite tricky to achieve. Again, Hasperbot can simulate remotely a user to sign any data. And this is really tricky how to solve this problem in current systems. Because we are talking about transaction signing, usually some secret is involved. This may be a private key for digital signatures as well as some kind of shared secret for other schemes. So for attacker, it should be difficult to generate valid signature without this secret. When good cryptographic algorithms are used, this requirement is usually met. But as always, homebrew crypto should be avoided. Again, Sławek showed us some examples of bad crypto in protocols. Good cryptographic algorithms should also eliminate collisions in signatures. But if the data which is signed is shortened in any way, then the attacker can find useful collision in the data before signing. And this is the reason why limited modification of operation in progress is possible when challenge response token is used. With malware, why not? Okay, there are easier targets. Okay, the easiest target is always the user, so if you can convince user that he needs to enter this, sorry, I was supposed to stand in the light. So if the attacker is able to convince the user to enter code received in the SMS, because you are testing if our SMS system is working correctly, then you can't use technology to solve that kind of problems, sorry. But if the attacker sees any value if in those collisions, then he will be able to use it. And we can discuss this later because we were able to exploit it some time ago. Okay, last thing, even though the impact of replay attack is usually limited, then such types of attacks should be also prevented. Some kind of nonce should be used during signature process or for all other schemes, for example, in challenge response. So to do a quick recap. As for now, there is no perfect methods, but some methods are better than others. You can and you should evaluate the effectiveness of your controls and try to improve them. But you must remember that the weakest link is always there, and this is the user. And we are really bad educators, as again it was said in the first lecture today. So even if your transaction integrity verification control is good, you still should create the next layer of defense, because the defense in-depth approach is really, really good. This layer should focus on detecting some anomalies in users' behavior and stopping activities which just don't fit. Also, some big data analysis techniques can be used to spot strange behavior. For example, it is rather strange when suddenly large number of users sends large amount of money to some newly created account. And maybe there is something to check in this case. Generally, if you cannot prevent something from happening, you should at least be able to detect it and react. Thank you. So, are there any questions?
Do you have any questions? Oh, just a second.
How about awareness as a line of defense against user vulnerabilities?
Awareness and user educations, of course. But you need to have a decent control so that this control can be effective. For example, if your bank tells you that the hardware token is great because this is hardware and this is token, this is not true.
Okay, you said there is no perfect method currently, but what about challenge response method with time used to generate signature and with limits on the number of challenges generated by the server side? Because I think it's fully secure in your diagram, and in the meantime it's user-friendly and easy to implement by the banking system.
Easy to user-friendly. You need to pass this challenge to the token. So this is not user-friendly, especially if you need to do on the small keyboard.
It's as user-friendly as the normal challenge, as the regular challenge response method.
Okay, could you describe this method as more? How would you pass this information about transaction details to that signing device? Because this is the main problem. Human interface, and human will not be very happy about typing long string of randomly generated characters. So. Sorry? Yes, but what would you use as a signing device? Your phone? Is it secure?
No, the device from the banking system.
Yes,
of
and
course,
this could be secure, of course, but there are problems. Cost of this solution, and this is not very sexy, sorry. Tokens were sexy several years ago.
Can you just manage the browser? Because he can change the code.
Yes, he can change the code, but then the response would not be valid, and this transaction will not be...
The challenge code.
And the... Okay, but okay. So basically, in ideal world, you would receive all information for transaction to your device. This would be presented to you. Based on this information presented to you, the challenge would be derived. So this is exactly what you see, and then response for that would be generated. So no, man in the browser will not defeat this control.